Nick, I suppose if you had a coat of arms, the motto would be education, 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 because you taught in schools before and after the BBC, and during the BBC, your career was entirely in education departments. Tell me about getting in. Did you have the usual five Portland Place interviews with a fish tank to keep you calm while you were waiting?
Yes, I had the full Monty. I can't remember who they all were, but I probably would be able to know them by status. There was Charles Armour, who was head of the school radio department. There would have been Charles Armour. There would have been Barbara Todd, who was very important, and most people will remember her from appointments. There was a chap from the School Broadcasting Council. I think there was the controller or deputy controller of education, whose name was Don Grattan, I think. So there was a good turnout anyway. It was worth my trip from Bournemouth down to down to Portland Place.
Right.
And I think the interview went pretty well. And then nothing. Oh, that's
Yes.
right. When I got back to the school, because I'd had to take the morning off from school, when I got back to school, they said they had a phone call from the BBC, and of course my heart began to beat furiously. And I said, "What did they leave a message?" Yes, they said they wanted to know what class of degree I had. And as my class of degree wasn't that brilliant, I was a bit chagrined about that. But anyway, then the weeks went past, and I didn't hear anything. And I wrote, and they said, please be patient. Then I got to the point, well, I had to either resign my teaching job or not. You know, it got to
Yes.
that deadline. So I rang up the BBC and I said, you either want me or you don't want me. And next day I got the letter. And that was a very exciting moment. I can remember walking back to my digs thinking, I'm finally going to get to join the BBC. It was for a fully fledged producer in school radio to produce the history output for the 9 to 11-year-old age group, that's to say the top 2 years of primary school.
Right.
And although I didn't know it at the time, I was joining a tradition which went right back to 1925. My predecessor, Duncan Taylor, had produced the output for 20 years, and before him, the novelist and broadcaster Rhoda Power had done the job for 20 years or so. And right back in 1925, I discovered one Jack Stobart had been recruited from the Ministry of Education, as then was, to help the BBC thinking about what role the new form of broadcasting could have for education, or what role it might play. 3 people before me, so I could see my ancestry, as it were. In the history area, the preceding series which I took over was called Stories from World History, and one week it would be about a Chinese emperor, and the next it had been the sailing of the Mayflower, and the week after that it would be something from ancient Rome. And I was given the job of devising a completely new series for the primary schools. So what I had to do was complete a year's worth of broadcasting that had already been set up, my predecessor having retired, and then in the following year my own series would begin. And so that was quite a challenge, but it meant I was given a fairly free range. Joe Reed, who was my boss, who's the chief assistant for that part of the output, was hugely supportive. He was a wonderful character. He'd come into the BBC from teaching, and he wasn't a programme maker himself, but he knew how to support his lads, as he used to refer to us. And we had a couple of guys from training college who were heavily into what I considered to be very obscure history. I wanted to do something which was much more chronological. I was brought up on our island story, which older listeners might just about remember. I think it influenced a whole generation of historians. Just a chronological romp through British history, picking out the best stories. And I thought, why tell an obscure story when there is the children need to know all the kind of the stories which contribute most to our culture.
Now, I want to know a bit more about curriculum and how it was, in a sense, prescribed, because the Schools Broadcasting Council was quite powerful. But also, I want to know the difference between schools broadcasting and children's. They were separate departments, presumably.
Yes. Well, there's quite a lot of questions there. The By the time I arrived, children's broadcasting on the radio had more or less ceased to exist. There was a little bit in a corner here and a little bit in a corner there. There was Listen with Mother still, of course, and that was really about it. There were various attempts made to resuscitate Children's Hour, as then was, but that had finished in, I think, 1964, and because it was felt there just wasn't an audience for it with the massive audience of children. As far as the Schools Broadcasting Council was concerned, education or schools broadcasting was rather different from the rest of the output, because the output was made at the request of the Schools Broadcasting Council. So the BBC funded it, but they didn't have, as it were, editorial control over it. I mean, they would obviously have the normal editorial control over whether a programme was good, bad or indifferent, but the actual subjects covered and the way they were covered was determined by, in this case, the primary committee of the Schools Broadcasting Council, which had on it all sorts of educational worthies, representatives from the Department of Education. There were historians from the Historical Association, and they would meet once or twice a year, and we would generate proposals which would go to them for approval. Usually it was approved. Very often they would say things like, have you thought about this and have you thought about that? And there was also, it's important to say, the Schools Broadcasting Council employed a whole team of education officers. So again, we were slightly different from the rest of the output. The education officers were very often ex-teacher training college lecturers or senior teachers, and they would monitor the output. They would go out and listen to the programs going out in the schools and write reports. And then at the end of a series, they would write a whole report on the series. And so we got this fantastic feedback, and it really was very, very valuable. And so as a program maker, I worked closely with my colleagues from the education offices, as we should call them. And just occasionally I would go out with them and listen to the programs going out myself. And sometimes if the program hadn't gone very well, we would say, well, shall we go out and play cricket with the children? And sometimes we went out and played cricket with the children. It was always a good day out. The teachers themselves would also report back. So you would build up your own personal little following of teachers who would comment or would write in with how the class reacted. So that would come in, a week after the programme had gone out. So, you couldn't do anything with the programme then, but if you came to repeat that programme, you would think, oh, yes, that bit wasn't quite clear, so perhaps we'll just adjust that or whatever. So, there was no reason why the programme shouldn't get better and better.
Yeah, but this was before the national curriculum. So in effect, you were providing material hoping that it would be useful, but not necessary to each school, to every school, because presumably different schools had different ideas about what they taught.
I think up to a point that's true. I mean, when I did my teaching in the early 1970s, it was a bit of a free-for-all, to be quite honest, and a lot of children were managing to get through just doing painting. People who taught at that stage wouldn't necessarily agree, but a better way of looking at it, I think, is that teachers taught to their strengths. And my experience was that a teacher who is interested in history would most likely take the programmes and then get a lot of value out of them, because the programmes were also teacher training in their own right, because very few primary school teachers had particular expertise in history unless they'd done that as a major subject during their teacher training, but most hadn't. So if you were trying to make a programme, let us say, about the Great Plague, most teachers wouldn't know very much about it. So when you made the programme and when you supported it with the publications that went with it, and the posters and all the other support that surrounded the actual radio broadcast, you had to think, well, the teacher may well be starting from scratch here, so you'd be thinking all the time, what does a teacher need to know in order to be able to help deliver this programme, mediate the programme, if you like, most effectively.
Now, were you using drama a lot, or was this largely documentary style material?
No, it was, my starting point was storytelling, and storytelling, I think, is particularly on the radio, is a wonderful medium, because the child who is listening, or the adult for that matter who is listening, contributes to the programme by making up the pictures in their own head. And because they've done that, they've taken part in the act of creation, if you like. It's very much more memorable. So almost all the stuff that I did initially on that original history series was dramatised in one form or another.
You've done some drama at university, I think, so dealing with actors and so on was something you could do without too much challenge.
I suppose so, yes. I mean, I had a good background in drama. I'd acted on the stage at school. When I was 18, I think, I helped found the youth theatre based on Salisbury Rep, Stage 65. I was the founder member, and I was the first secretary of it, or chair. I can't remember quite what I was, but I know I had a book with the names and addresses of all the girls who wanted to be on the stage in the southern half of Wiltshire, which was more than most young men of that age had. And Stage 65 still keeps going today, going from strength to strength. The one thing that I've ever done or been involved in that has survived the test of time.
Yes. In television, you would not have gone in as a producer. You would have gone as an assistant producer and so on, and worked your way up that way. So it's interesting that you could go straight into radio and produce. But so presumably they'd asked you at the interview about your experience with things like drama, had they?
Well, I would have argued it something like this, that I was the last generation, as I think you were, to be brought up on children's hour. We didn't have any television at home. We only had the radio. And I used to run home from school to catch up with the latest edition of Toy Town or Jennings at school or Norman and Henry Bones, all those classic dramas. So I already knew an awful lot about radio production. It sounds daft, doesn't it? But I knew things like that at an end of the scene, you repeated the last sentence. You repeated the last sentence. And that, so that the sound could be faded out without losing anything. But it would tell the audience, this is the end of the scene.
Yes.
And so I did actually know quite a lot about it. Because, for years and years and years, I'd been listening to it avidly. So when I got to the studio, well, apart from anything else, I met some of the characters from my childhood listening, which is some of the actors who'd played the parts.
Yes.
That was nice. Carlton Hobbs, I remember meeting. But I think it's true to say that in radio, that role of assistant producer that existed in television didn't exist. You came in as a producer and you got on with it. There was a certain amount of training. There would have been a 3-week training course that I think after I'd been. But most of the people who came in were people who'd had quite extensive teaching careers. They were heads of department, things like that. So, so I was very lucky to get in as young as I was. But I don't think that mattered so much. I never felt sort of that I couldn't do it. But I observed lots of people who were out of their depth in both radio and in television. And I think a lot of the people who I counted in television wouldn't have survived in radio. They just wouldn't have survived because there was no one to support you in the way there is in television.
Tell me about the equipment you were using and whether you had engineers in the studio at the same time, or was this a sort of self-op job?
Oh, no. Self-op is something I would never have got anything onto the air if it had been anything. The normal practice for a school's drama would be to spend the morning getting together all the music and the sound effects. And there would almost always were 2 studio managers, as they were then called. Their titles have changed over the years and changed back again, but I call them studio managers. The older and usually very grand one would sit at the desk controlling the pots, as we would call them, the rotary pots which adjusted the sound levels. And some would be very bored because they'd been doing it for so long. Some would knit while you scrabbled around sorting out the sound effects. Then you'd go through the script with the number 2 studio manager who would sort out the music and sort out the sound effects and perhaps pre-record some spot effects like doors opening, We worked out of One Portland Place, and we were quite lucky because we had in One Portland Place 3 general purpose studios. They were really talk studios, but they were equipped with staircases and doors and some of the paraphernalia you need for radio. So they weren't grand spaces like you got in the big drama studios, but they were perfectly adequate for making radio drama. Then after lunch, at 2 o'clock, you'd reconvene. The actors would arrive. You'd sit round the table, and you'd read through the script, and then you'd proceed to record it bit by bit. As my career went on, my programs got more and more complicated, and we did much more sort of multi-tracking, but the equipment was still 1950s equipment rather than the sort of things that you might sit at today. Well, today with your computer you can do all the things and much more that you could do in that sort of studio. We had an echo room somewhere in the building, and the signal would be sent to the echo plates in the echo room and come back again if you wanted to add some baronial castle
reverb. Yes, great.
Yeah, reverb, yes.
Yes. Now, what about editing? Presumably it was a razor blade job, was it, in those days?
Usually it was a razor blade job. I was once asked to go and edit my own, some of my own material, which I'd recorded on a portable recorder, but it had no break on it, and I think I burst into tears at some point, swore I would never do it again. So, and I never did edit with a razor blade again. There was one studio manager who I remember who edited with a pair of embroidery scissors, but she and I didn't get on because when the session ran out of time, she walked out with all these little bits of 1/4-inch tape all over the floor, which I had somehow to stick together. So we never worked together again. But yes, you'll be given something like 4 hours maximum to edit a normal 20-minute program with an engineer or a studio manager. And ideally, it would be somebody who'd actually worked on the program, but it didn't always work out that way. Then you had to play the program back and sign all the various bits of paper that proved that it was ready for transmission, and then you said goodbye and good luck to it.
Yeah. Now, presumably you had a sort of repertory company of actors, and they'd be very experienced, so presumably they would take a script.
Oh, yes. We had a superb array of very, very professional actors who was the school repertory company. I think there were about 5 or 6 of them, and they were working at it day after day. So, if one day they would be Henry VIII, and the next day they'd be a teapot or something. So that they would just do whatever you threw at them. Then there was the drama repertory company, where you had sort of second dibs on. That was a much bigger group of people. And then beyond that, you could employ freelancers. And our budget in those days was usually such that you could go half and half. You could have half freelancers and you could have half rep, either school or main drama rep. Which prevented the programme from all beginning to sound the same, which of course they would do if you used the same bunch of actors over and over again. So I was very lucky, and I could ask anybody to come along, and if they wanted to, they did.
Huge names in acting would find the little bit of money that they made on a radio programme very helpful for a couple of hours' work, I suppose.
Well, I once had an actor in the studio who shall be nameless who said, could he go out for half an hour? And I said, well, you want to go for half an hour? He said, I've got a voiceover down the road in Soho. So I said, OK, well, don't be more than half an hour. He wasn't. And he came back and we got on with the programme. And about 3 months later, I got a bottle of something or another left on my desk. And apparently he'd earned more doing that one voiceover than school radio would ever pay him in his whole lifetime.
Yes, quite. Most memorable programmes. Can you think of any that particularly stand out?
I made a programme about sinking the Titanic. And I think Sue Lawley came along and did the narration for that, and she was gorgeous. And I think children were very, very moved about that. I did another programme where I took a tape recorder down the sewers in central London and walked up the old Fleet River. That was memorable. In the same series, I took a specially adjusted ewer down the coal mine, recorded 300 minors all using the F word at the same time. Editing somewhat difficult for the children.
Now, what were the transmission times and what stations were you on? Was this FM or was it AM or what?
Well, when I first started, it's quite interesting because when I first started, school radio was on the medium wave, and which was interesting because we got a lot of eavesdropping audience. We got the sort of whatever, people doing the ironing or driving their truck or whatever. And so I would get letters from all sorts of people, sort of say they'd enjoyed the programme or asking a question or what was the music, all those sort of things. Then after a couple of years, we transferred onto VHF, FM as we now call it, and we had to learn new skills because we could now broadcast in stereo. But of course, we lost at the same time all our eavesdropping audience, so it was only the schools that listened. And thus we went on and on and on over the years until we got to the start of Radio 5 in 1990, or 1990, yes, 1990 it started, where we were put back onto medium wave again. And of course, there was great rumpus about that because what we were actually offering the schools was an inferior product, a much inferior product, technical quality-wise. I don't know whether it's of any interest, but in order to assuage the anger of the schools, the BBC invented this plug, like a transformer plug, which, because by this time I'd become head of the department, I was responsible for distributing to all the schools in the country so that their FM radios would pick up the medium wave. That's essentially what it did. But then, sadly, one of them burst into flames, and every single one had to be withdrawn, and we had to start again. That is a lesser-known story of the original Radio 5. But
good Lord!
Well, I don't think any schools were actually burnt down.
No, but it only needs one, doesn't it, to ruin your plan?
Well, it cost the BBC, over £1 million at a time when £1 million would have made you quite a lot of programmes.
Yeah. But going back to the earlier days in schools radio, it's interesting you became head of the department later. Presumably that meant you gave up production, but you moved from sort of history to kind of current affairs. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd been making history programmes for some while. I'd done lots of other things, but that was my main thing. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to do something which was a little bit more immediate? And I had a view that children, that's to say, and I'm talking top primary, lower secondary school age children, are bombarded with news. It's coming at them from all directions, but what is there to help them understand it and make sense of it? And I'd always had this feeling that it should somehow have a place in the curriculum, and that the children should be engaged by the fact that there's an election going on, or there's been a disaster, or the Prime Minister has been sacked, or whatever. And so I sort of pitched this idea, and because I'd done reasonably well with the radio broadcasts up to that point, people began to listen, and it was then a question of going around persuading people and bending ears. I talked to Radio News, and in Larry Hodgson I found a kindred spirit who was happy to help me with this, and eventually we came up with the idea of doing the programme live once every Thursday morning during term time. We would top the programme with a bulletin specially written by Radio News from the newsroom, and then we would make various items, as in magazine programme format that would interest children. We included a piece of pop music each week, and sometimes we managed to get whoever sang it to come in and say a few words. Probably one of the most interesting things we did was get children to write letters to us. And this was, I think, we were one of the early programmes to pioneer using the audience to generate copy for the programmes. It wasn't done widely, but now you listen to Radio 3 and they're endlessly asking for people to make suggestions. You listen to some of the magazine programmes, there's a much greater desire to engage with the audience, because the audience has got so much more experience than your production team has, and can suggest things which of course then become items for the programme. So eventually, I think in 1982, this thing got launched. To begin with, I'd nervously stockpiled all sorts of items, and I suddenly realised that that wasn't the way to do it. Throw all those things away, and each week was brand new, and we would start work on Monday morning, and by Thursday we'd have a have a programme, we'd broadcast it. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was not quite so good. Then I'd go off and have a pizza down the road and have Friday off and start again. So it was a completely different way from working, because the drama series, because of all the publications that went with it, took a huge amount. It was, like the old oil tanker, and it took a lot to turn it round.
Now, how did you judge tone when you were doing something for children, so that you avoided being patronising?
I don't know. I mean, it's a very difficult question, because I was very critical of a lot of the output for children, and that I did think was patronising. I think it was partly to do with trying not to talk down, trying to find out what the children's interest is in it, trying to treat the audience as sensible in the way you would treat an adult audience. I think the thing in the news is that we help children to understand what news was, which is an interesting concept in its own right, and we would take seriously what they wrote to us in their letters. So they would write to us and say something like, "Oh, we can't hear the programme because the jets keep going over." And so we then made an item where we got the command of the local RAF station to come along and talk to the children about the jets, and promised to fly them off in a different direction on a Thursday morning. We had another good one where the children wrote to say that their teacher had gone through the floorboards while they'd been listening to the programme the previous week, and so we went to the county council and said, "Isn't it about time you repaired this school?" Or we got the children to say this, because the school wasn't being maintained properly. What we were trying to do was show the children, if you like, in a kind of roundabout sort of way, that they did have they had a voice, and that they had some power, and it might not have been great power, but they did have some. This got more and more interesting, because we then thought it would be interesting if the children actually made some news. So we did a survey of what children did at breakfast time. So we wrote to all the schools that were listening, had to fill in a questionnaire, and we got all the questionnaire sort of coded and logged, and all the statistics that emerged. And so we had an item that I think certainly made it onto all the radio bulletins and into the press, describing what children do when they get up in the morning, and we had so much data. We had something like 60,000 responses, so we had a huge amount of data, so that we could say, actually, in Glasgow, they have a different diet at breakfast time than they do down in Hampshire, and make some sort of regional comparisons. And I think that culminated the following year in us doing one on bedtime activities. The breakfast time had been reported in the Sun on page 5, so we were able to broadcast on the day of the broadcast. So we'd say, if you turn to page 5, you'll see a write-up of our survey. So I rang up the then editor of the Sun and said, "If we do it the same next year and I give you exclusive, would you put it onto page 3? And that's exactly what happened. So we did the bedtime survey, and my presenter was able to say, and if you turn to page 3 of today's Sun, you'll find a write-up of our bedtime survey. And I was really pleased about that. I thought that was, because it showed them that the children that they had actually made some news, and it was in the papers, it was on the television. I was sitting on an aeroplane a year later, and it was in the flight magazine, or the in-flight magazine. So it has to be said that nothing like that is available today for children. I mean, there are things hidden away on the internet, but the important thing about the broadcast was it was mediated by the teacher. And so you could do things that you couldn't do on John Craven's Newsround and things like that. You could do quite how we would cope in recent times with COVID and some of the political decisions and the sort of killings explode. I don't know. Yes. I think it would be very difficult to do now. But that's not to say that somebody shouldn't be making the effort to talk to children about what's going on in the world around them, because I think the world around them now is a great deal more frightening than it was in the early 80s when we were fighting the Falklands War, but it was a long way away. It wasn't sort of inside the classroom, as it were. Yeah,
sure. Now, I think you used children to do interview. I mean, you mentioned, I think, in what you wrote to me, Robert Maxwell. That would have been interesting. How did that go?
That was hilarious. I took 2 or 3 children along to Maxwell House or Mirror House, or I can't remember where it is in the middle of the city of London, and we were all a bit nervous, but we were welcomed by the editor of the Sunday Times and the editor of the Times. And my memory is that they had men in sort of 18th century costume waiting on us and bringing us tea and coffee, and the time went past, and the children were given a lot of lemonade to drink as we waited and waited and waited, and then the inevitable happened. The children needed the loo, so the editor of the Sunday Times, I think it was, kindly took them off to the loo, and then the whole wall, while they were gone, the whole wall opened up, and there was a fantastic panorama of the City of London, all lit up at night, and silhouetted against it was the figure of Mr. Maxwell. "Where," he boomed, "are the children?" To which the editor that hadn't taken the children to the loo said, "They've gone to the loo, sir." So that was a great start. But having said that, the children got on and asked him their questions, and what they really wanted to know is why wouldn't he do a children's newspaper? Because he had in the past promised and never done it. And so he said that it was a brilliant idea, and yes, children had their own perspective on the news, which was perfectly valid. He dealt with them very nicely. When I tried to interrupt, he shut me down and said, "No, it's the children who are interviewing me." And next day there was a good write-up in the Mirror all about the interview, and there were photographs of the children with a beaming Mr. Maxwell, and but there never was a children's newspaper coming out of it.
No.
But it made good copy for the programme, and it gave the programme a lot of status as well. Nobody could argue with a children's programme that got onto the front page of the Mirror that day.
Yeah. And what about Bob Geldof? I think you said you had trouble with him.
Oh, well, I mean, I think that was at the height of the campaign to save the world, and he wanted to come in and talk for 40 minutes, and we gave him, I think, 2 minutes, and that wasn't long enough. So there was a lot of effing and blinding, but there always is with Bob Geldof. That comes with the package.
Yes, your razor blades be red hot. Now, at some stage, you went over to television. You had schools broadcasting on radio, schools broadcasting on television. Were they, in a sense, rivals for attention?
There was yes and no. I mean, there was an attempt made to coordinate, but there was quite a big difference between the two departments. I mean, we were in central London, important place. They were over in Ealing. I think there existed historically a tension between the two departments, which is true between radio and television anyway. Historically,
yes.
Radio for a long time had been the premier service, and television was a sort of little upstart that may or may not. Reith never thought much of it, etc. And then, of course, television takes all the audience and gets all the money, and things are reversed. There was a little element of that. Some of the people in the 1950s who were working in school radio went off to television, and there really wasn't much of a transfer of personnel between the two. We shared the Educational Broadcasting Council, obviously, and we shared the education officers, and we met fairly frequently to coordinate and to discuss things and whatever, but I wanted to go to television after I'd been radio for some years. It was an obvious career move. Eventually, I got an attachment for 3 months. It wasn't very successful. Came back again, got on with radio. I was slightly more senior now, so I had more managerial roles.
Yes. You became head of department, didn't you? Schools radio head.
Well, no, in actual fact, what the order of things was, I then went back to, I think in the mid-80s, Ivor Gwynne-Jones was on her way to becoming, well, I think she'd become head of school television. She knew me and she knew my work, so she invited me to come over. So I went back to being an assistant producer, which you mentioned earlier on. So I was chief producer in radio, went back to being assistant producer, but I got on with the job of doing the history series, which had slightly fallen on hard times, and its audience had dwindled away down to about 10% of all the schools, I seem to remember.
Really? Yeah.
So I was given a fairly free hand to get on and see if I could make some programmes which would get some of the audience back, because ITV at the time, or Channel 4, I suppose, had a very successful series called How We Used to Live, which, was sweeping the board with the BBC. The BBC were just not competing with it at all. So that was the challenge for me. And I suddenly found I had a team working for me of all these producers who'd been working in television for years, working to this strange man from radio. But we made some good programs, and the nicest thing Ivan ever said to me was, Ivan Gwynne-Jones, was that there's always laughter coming out of your office. And I thought, well, that's a really, really nice thing for anybody to say. I think I sort of adjusted to television without too much difficulty. I think lots of television people would benefit enormously from working, I've already hinted, would benefit enormously from working in radio to begin with, because the sound is so important in television, and so many of the television producers just dubbed on a bit of music here or dubbed in a few sound effects and didn't realise that you could use the sound and the music to drive your programme along and create atmosphere and all sorts of things. So what did I do? I got to make some programmes in the Tower of London, and they were what I suppose we would call drama documentaries, i.e. very, very cheap. No budget at all. So, if you needed to show Shakespeare writing, it would be my hand with a sort of ornamental cuff on it that would appear in the shot. And various bits of me would be used like that as I learnt my craft. I decided very early on I wasn't interested in working in studio. The television studios I found completely terrifying. So avoided that. So almost all the television I then did was on film, and then later on tape.
Did you enjoy the business of editing film?
Oh yeah, I thought that was fantastic. In fact, the best relationships I had, I thought, while working in television was with the film editors, because that's where an awful lot of the creativity happened. You'd come back with all your rushes, and you'd gloomily look through it, and it'd been a foggy day, and a bit of equipment had broken down, and all the things that can go wrong in television had sort of gone wrong. And I think there was a how to be a television director guidebook that I had, and I don't know whether it was BBC production. But the editor is saying to the director, "It's rubbish. Well, but I'll do what I can with it." So it felt very much like that. It was that relationship, and also the relationship with the Radiophonic Workshop, because I worked a lot with the Radiophonic Workshop, and they would compose whole scores for the programmes. And because I had that background, I could see what it could add to television. So I was then in television for I think about 3 years, and during which time I actually managed to get some awards and things for the programmes that I made. But they came after I'd gone back to. I then went back to school radio as head of department, saying goodbye to my television colleagues for the time being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now tell me about management, because it's all very well. If you're a producer, it's always talked about as the best job in broadcasting, but now you were going into management. What are the challenges of that?
Well, I mean, it's quite difficult. It's a good question, because I can't quite remember why I wanted to do that, because my television career was opening up, and it was I was being given some nice jobs to do. But I think my heart was still in school radio, and I still believed very intensely that what school radio did was very, very important, and that it really did make a contribution to the educational world. And it had gone through a very bad patch, and so the department was suffering because of it. And I suppose part of my motivation was I wanted to try and sort out some of those things. I also, having worked on both sides, radio and television, wanted very much to see radio and television integrated so that we could offer, the strengths of both media, rather than, there being this slight competitive feeling between the two, and insufficient joint planning and recognition that, radio could do some things better than TV, and TV clearly do some things far better than radio, and we should work to our strengths. So that was partly my motivation, apart from the money, of course, and the status. It would be ridiculous to ignore that.
How many people were you managing?
I think I had, there were about 70 people in the department, of whom I think...
That's a very large number.
35. Well, it was one of the biggest radio departments, if not the biggest at the time.
Yeah.
I was quite definitely the youngest. As I'd been the youngest producer, I suppose quite reasonably, I think I was then the youngest head of department. But it was not a job made in heaven. It was all going to go wrong. But,
But you had to deal with the management upstairs, them upstairs, with the controllers and so on. Whereas as a producer, you didn't.
I had to wear a suit for the first time. When I first joined the BBC, I was convinced I needed a blue suit. And I kept putting off this blue suit when I first arrived. And then I finally got in and went to my first departmental meeting where I saw people wearing flared, embroidered jeans and things like that, and realised that perhaps a suit wasn't quite right. And then I realised that a suit actually meant something completely different in BBC parlance. Now I was wearing a suit. I mean, to start with, it was all fine, but there were a couple of, they weren't exactly straws, they were brickbats in the wind. When Irene Gwyn Jones rang me up to say I'd got the job after the interview, she said, "It's yours if you want it." And those words, "if I want it," sort of, they sounded a bit odd. But I did want it, so I turned up on the first day. And I thought I would be taken out to lunch, which is the normal convention, by the managing director, who at that time was David Hatch. But David Hatch didn't take me out for lunch. I was taken out for lunch by somebody else, and I realised that was not a good augur of what was going to happen.
Now, do you think this was because schools broadcasting was beginning to lose its importance?
You could argue that, but it wasn't to do with that. It was to do with the government's decision to stop simulcasting, broadcasting the same things on the same wavelength. So what prior to me getting this job, or alongside me getting this job, the BBC had decided that it would seize what would otherwise be the vacant medium wave and put Radio 5 onto it. And Radio 5 would be a way of placing sport, but it would be also a place where they could get rid from Radio 4 FM of these school broadcasts. And so that was in the pipeline. That's why, if I'd known more about what that was going to involve, I probably wouldn't have taken the job. But I was, I think, shall we say, naive about it. We're in 1989, if you like. So I didn't know very much about it, but then I was eating my supper one night and the 6 o'clock news came on, and it announced that Pat Ewing, the then head of Radio Sport, had been made head of radio and made controller of Radio 5, the new channel to be. And she would now be my immediate boss. And it has to be said that Pat Ewing and I, we tried, but we were such different people from such different broadcasting backgrounds. I mean, sport and education. Sports, you broadcast a football match, shall we say, and you've got 2 hours of broadcasting under your belt. 2 hours of broadcasting would be, would take a radio education producer months to produce. So you've got two sorts of broadcasting. I said, look, this plan for Radio 5 isn't going to work because the schools haven't got the equipment to listen to Radio 4, and why should they have to put up with a second-rate quality a system of listening to it? And I then experienced what management was like. I'd been in the BBC for 16 years, and on the whole, I'd been patted on the head for most of the things I did. I began to get notes from David Hatch. I think they're called hatchlings, or hatchlets. Hatchlets, I think they're.
Hatchlets, yes.
I think that's what Will Wyatt has called them anyway. Little handwritten, undated notes. And I could see that things weren't going to go very well. I insisted that Radio 5 starts at the start of the autumn term. I said, you can't have a break in transmission and have all this technical hoo-ha in January. So that didn't make matters any easier for Pat Ewing, because she now had 3 or 4 months less to get this station on the air. It was also a time of cutbacks, and anyone who wasn't involved in the start of Radio 5 would say, hey, there's no money for this and there's no money for that, we've been cut on this, and you're starting a new channel. What on earth's going on? Well, I was saying things like, we're starting a new channel, and where's the promotion for it? Where's the push? Where are the big names that we're bringing in to sort of... But because, of course, it was in order, from the BBC's position, they wanted to hang on to that medium wave and not lose it to a commercial outfit or something like that, which they were in danger of losing unless they could demonstrate that they were using it for... Now they could no longer use it for simulcasting, if that's the right word. So what I did, I reorganised the department under Pat's instruction to include not only the school broadcasting, but children's broadcasting and youth broadcasting. I was summoned to David Hatch, and I was given a new title. So I now became Head of Schools, Children and Youth Broadcasting, or HSKIP, I think we called it. And it was very grand, but it came with no extra money. David was very, very clear about that. about that. There was no extra production money either, and I could see as I looked at the schedule that we would be doing less drama for children in the new regime than we were doing in school broadcasting under the old. So that, of course, meant that a lot of people had to go. So a lot of some of the producers had to be sent on their way. I mean, a lot took early retirements, which made it a lot easier for me personally.
That must be one of the worst things about management, when you've got to let people go, as the euphemism is.
Yeah, it's not much fun, either letting go or being let go. Sometimes it depends on the circumstances, I think. Sometimes I think one has to recognise what one has run one's course, or that one has become, as I recognised eventually, that I was the problem rather than the solution, and that things wouldn't, that I wasn't making things any better, and I wasn't contributing to making them any better. So it was time to sling one's hook, as it were, but to try and go under the best possible circumstances. So what then happened was that upstairs, management, that's to say management above me, tried to bring a disciplinary case against me for not working properly, but I could turn around and say, well, look, I have recruited some really outstanding people to work on Radio 5, and I've done this, and I've done that, and that. So that wouldn't stick. So in the end, I said I would go if I could go back to school television. And I had this amazing last meeting with David Hatch, who I was very fond of. Everybody was fond of David Hatch. You couldn't not be fond of him. He wasn't sometimes as brave as he might have been in some of these kind of difficult situations, but I think he realised that I was being shafted, but what could he do about it? Because he had personally committed to Radio 5. But so I went to his office in Broadcasting House. We sat down on his nice sofas, and then the television set was on, because he was always on, because he was always watching the news. It was the day that Geoffrey Howe got up to speak and demolished Mrs. Thatcher. And he gave Margaret Thatcher what for, and talked about cricketing metaphor. He used a cricketing metaphor, going out and finding the captain had broken your bat and everything. So David and I watched this in, it was an extraordinary event. And when it was over, he said, "Well, Nick, you're going to have to go. I'm not making you redundant, but you're going to have to go. So there you are." And so we more or less shook hands on it, and that was that. And I was allowed to go back to, I went, so I had a tearful farewell from school radio, but it was pretty upsetting. But I could see that, I was now the problem. And Radio 5 would carry on. What I did do is I wrote a fairly comprehensive paper about the BBC attitude to school broadcasting, and how this was not the way to treat it. And if you wanted an audience of the future, you had to think about how that was going to happen if you were going to be put school broadcasting, which did a lot of good work. Not all of it was brilliant, but some of it was very good indeed. And then I went and sat down with the DG and went through with it. And I said, look, Radio 5's not going to work. It's a ridiculous mix of things. And what you've done in setting it up is you've eviscerated school radio. So, and he said, right, okay. So I went back to school television. I mean, I don't think I was alone in predicting that Radio 5 would come unstuck, and it did. And John Burke came along and realised it was ridiculous. And what happened? I think Pat Ewing had to go. David Hatch was bumped upstairs to a role without portfolio, and Radio 5 Live, as we now call it, has gone from strength to strength since then. But it did cause, not just for me, but it caused for a lot of people a lot of heartache, and it wasn't a good time. I'm looking up at the problem, and I could only see a fraction of it, and it was thought that something had to happen. But I think school radio then was left homeless. And so the bi-media department, which is what I'd hoped to create, was sort of created by accident, and a sort of bi-media department of sorts was created. But shortly after that, television broadcasting was moved into the middle of the night and is no longer the force it was. So school broadcasting has gone into the doldrums. just recently, with the COVID crisis, the BBC has put much greater effort into its education. With Bite Size, yes, I mean, Bite Size was a phrase coined many years ago by Liz Cleaver, who I appointed to the BBC, so I have some responsibility for Bite Size, but I don't like the word. It suggests of short attention spans. And the word that we always used to use was enrichment. We would enrich the curriculum with our programmes. We wouldn't be the curriculum, but we would enrich it. Underneath that was a difference between Liz Cleaver and myself about the sort of programmes we should be making. She came from a secondary school background and was therefore thinking in terms of resources, i.e. something that an expert teacher who was expert in their subject could pluck off to illustrate a point, whereas my orientation was much more to do with storytelling. You know, that is a wholly appropriate medium when you're dealing with much younger children who know much less, but the story will help convey the information and the ideas, and if it's well told.
So it seems to me that your happiest time was probably making programmes in the earlier part of your career.
I worked for the BBC for 25 years, and out of that 25 years, I had 2 bad years and 23 wonderful years. So I'm not really grumbling about it at all. I mean, the Radio 5 episode was rough. There's no doubt about that. And I wasn't the only person roughed up by it, because essentially the BBC had got itself into a, shall we say, a rather silly situation over it. It was doing something which was not doing the right thing with at the right time. There was all sorts of things wrong with it, but they had to get on and do it because they'd committed to do it, and so there was just rather a lot of collateral damage. At the end of my career, when Producer's Choice had just come in, because what happened next was I went back to television and had another 5 or 6 good years of making television programmes, including some really quite engaging stuff. But at the end of that, when Producer's Choice came in, I was still being paid at the level of a suit, and they could have 3 for the price of me. So I remember making a programme about children working in the Victorian brick industry. I found this wonderful handmade brick yard somewhere in Suffolk where they were still making specials for places like Hampton Court, and they got a girl who was the brick thrower, and she was just straight out of the 18th century. You could find an engraving of a woman throwing bricks on a farm and making bricks, and so I used the children from the local school to do all the carrying off, and the problem with period drama is that very often the children look far too clean and rosy, and their clothes are immaculate. You can always tell how expensive a production is by how dirty the clothes are. If the clothes are dirty, they've spent the time all night long with a cheese grater, taking off all the, making them look as if they've been worn. And but that's what I did on that production. I kept saying to the makeup and more particularly to the costume, they're not scruffy enough, they're not dirty enough, and the children were meanwhile carrying all these large quantities of clay backwards and forwards, and I said, not dirty enough, roll in it. So they rolled in it, and in the end, they worked so hard on that production, and because it was a documentary, we didn't have all the normal rigmarole of people making sure the children weren't being abused. They did look pretty Victorian, but they were sort of drawn and haggard, and the clay had worked its way into their fingernails, and and it looked very good in the end.
Really authentic look. That's great.
The biggest the biggest production I did was Spy Watch, which was almost the last thing I did before I left. Well, it was a fully serviced costume drama, I suppose, and I persuaded the powers that be, quite how I don't know, to direct it as well as produce it. So this was my one go at directing some drama on TV, single camera. It was a story of a group of evacuees who'd gone to stay in the countryside, and one of the evacuees was a very useful 12 or 13-year-old Russell Tovey, who now seems to be in absolutely everything. Well, I like to think I gave him one of his early starts as an evacuee in Shropshire. We had a very, very good cast for that. Lots of interesting people were in it, along with Russell as a juvenile, and Leslie Joseph was the villainess in the piece. She was like a kind of Cruella de Vil character who hated having an evacuee dumped on her mansion, and she was either spying or into the black market, and was great fun to do. That was 8 weeks filming on location,
And the children were rumbling her, were they?
oh, they rumbled her in the end. I think they lock her in a shed at the end. But no, but I think it's slightly become a cult because it was part of a series called Look and Read, and Look and Read started in the 60s, I think, and every 18 months, 2 years, there was a new, and it was the most expensive thing that school telly ever did. My version of it had a budget of about £1 million, and that was a lot of money for educational broadcasting.
Wow, yes.
And it's a sort of thing that if you tried to actually pitch it as an idea, people would roar with laughter at you, and you wouldn't get anywhere with it at all. But what it consisted of was a sort of a 10-part series, 10 20-minute episodes with a cliffhanger story in each episode. But intercut with the actual drama were sort of songs in which taught you about good, better, best, and things like that, bits of grammar. That was a very, very strange amalgam. But it is now something, the series is now something of a cult, and anyone can find, if they look.
Pirated copies.
I worked far too hard looking back. The thing I regret most was that I was, 300 yards from the Wigmore Hall, and I never went to a concert there while I was working. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous looking back.
Yes. Anyway, to round it off, though, is there anything you want to say generally about the BBC culture then and now?
Oh, I've got very mixed feelings about it all. You can't have a fairly boisterous career. I mean, BBC gave me fantastic opportunities. I mean, I worked across such a range of programme making, from directing costume drama to live radio to radio drama, etc., and all sorts of documentaries in between. So gave me huge opportunities. I always felt sad that in the time I was there, the attitude to educational broadcasting was that it was an irritant rather than, an important part of what the BBC did, and that attitude got worse and worse and worse. And I think perhaps in recent years, reading the most recent BBC report, which seems to talk up education a lot more than it was, I would hope to see that carried through because of some actual substance to that, because the education in this country is not brilliant. It's got an awful lot of good things to do with it, but it has a lot of bad things. Teachers need a lot of support, and a lot of children don't do it as well as they could do. In my view, the BBC, in its the radio programmes and the school radio and the television programmes, all the publications that it produced for the schools, was an enormous contribution. Since asking me to do this interview, I've been doing a bit of research on the history of educational broadcasting on the radio, which goes actually right back to, as I said earlier, to 1925. In fact, it's a strange coincidence that the year and the month I was born, May 1947, was the same month that the BBC produced its first detailed book about educational broadcasting. And if you see what the status of educational broadcasting that was then, it was very, very high indeed. The 1944 Education Act had only just gone through, and I mean, the fact is that certainly in primary schools, many of the teachers are generalists. They don't know much science very often. They don't know much mathematics. They don't know much history. And the BBC was able to come in and sort of help them in the nicest possible way, if you like, to provide resources that the children would enjoy and get a lot out of, but would help the teacher do a better job, if you like.
Yes.
And the withdrawal of that, I think the BBC lost a trick. And looking back at the history, since I've been retired now for nearly as long as I worked for the BBC, but looking back, it seems to me that the BBC, it certainly needs to think hard about its attitude to education. I think in the past, the fact that it didn't fully control it was the programmes were made at the request of an outside body. The BBC weren't comfortable with that arrangement, but it was important that there was this interface between the BBC and the educational world. I think the BBC could look back at its history of educational broadcasting, and it might say, I think we might have lost a trick here. Given the predicament that the BBC is in at the moment, I mean, 25 years ago, it was being challenged, but the challenge now is in danger of being replaced. And yet,
Yes.
educational broadcasting, it could be one place where nobody, no politician, no matter how anti the BBC it is, could say the BBC is a load of rubbish, or it's biased, or if it's making a solid contribution to educating our children. That becomes a bedrock for the organisation,
Yes.
which would be difficult for any politician to argue against. I think what the BBC does for preschool children is brilliant. A lot of it is
Yes.
absolutely brilliant, and it majors on that. But I think it's the next age group upwards. I begin to, what the BBC now produces horrible histories, and horrible histories is fine. But after you watch a little bit, there's a terrible danger that it gets formulaic, and we can only enjoy history if it's being rude or making us laugh about something.
Yes, yes, correct.
I think you can offer a slightly more varied diet than that.
Right, I think you've probably covered most of it, haven't you? Thank you very much for doing this.
No, you're welcome.